Hello and welcome back for another lecture on the Introduction to Weather and Atmospheric Circulation. So this presentation is really going to build off of my previous one that dealt more with understanding Earth's atmosphere. This one in particular, this presentation, will introduce more of the circulation process. We'll also look at atmospheric fronts, and then we'll look at circulation. So I picked this fun photo right here. This is actually the first TV meteorologist. Is Dr. George Fishbeck. He actually just passed away a couple years ago, but he worked for KABC, which is ABC Channel 7, and he was our first, national really television meteorologist, which made it really an interesting piece for us here in Earth science because then it became a topic that was then more understood globally versus just looking at a traditional diagram like that you would see in a newspaper. That he was actually animating it and being able to give it life. If you ever are looking for something kind of fun to look at, Google like the 1950s and 60s weather reports, because nowadays we have green screens and they can point in different directions and say in California we're experiencing this and that. Um, During that time, it was actually just a big poster of the state or the nation, and they had a bunch of magnets, and they would just move the magnets with a pointer. How technology has changed in the last 15, 20 years is quite miraculous in this contribution. So within the modules on my Canvas page, I've introduced a lot of the Met organization, which is based out of the UK. They have a lot of great atmospheric study presentations, but also things to think about. If this excites you, there are classes about weather and climate. You should really think about taking one of those because it gives you a whole new perspective. A whole class. We're spending just really 35 minutes to an hour talking about the whole how our atmosphere works, how weather operates. This is an entire 16-week course, so there's a lot of great information that can be had. So let's kind of jump into this. So the first part is we're going to jump into just the idea of the three-celled model. There are other models that are used and that were identified, but since we know that the Earth is tilted at an angle and that it's rotating and orbiting, we know that this is how we're going to be dealing with it more particularly is with the three-celled model. Now, the first thing to introduce is the fact that the surface of the Earth is receiving solar radiation, but it's uneven in how that intensity and energy is being distributed. So because of that uneven heating of the Earth's surface, that is the driving force of weather, essentially moving in our patterns. So because of equilibrium, the balance of hot and cold, good and bad, right? Because of that, because of equilibrium, we have this motion and movement of warm and cold air and will continue to mix. Now, as I say here in the presentation, the sun's energy hits the equator more directly, causing air to expand and rise, moving towards the poles, and because of that motion of air, it actually displaces other parcels of air and causes them to move. So the three-celled model introduces us to these: the Hadley cells, the Ferrel cells, and the polar cells. So these cells are convectionary in their action and the fact that hot air rises, cold air sinks. But what's interesting about them is you have to imagine that this cell is like a tube that wraps all the way around the Earth. So it's not just in this one spot, it wraps around all the way around. So what we can see here, and we'll talk a little more about it in a moment, but I just want to kind of introduce it. So here we see the one cells represent the Hadley cell. So we have a Hadley cell that starts at the equator and terminates at 30 degrees north, and this tube wraps all the way around the Earth, right? Then we have a Ferrel cell, which is represented by the number 2, and then we have the polar cell here that's represented by number 3. So this is from 0 to 30 degrees, 30 to 60, and 60 to 90 degrees. Then there's a second set that goes all the way down to then the South Pole. So because of this motion of air moving up and down and sinking and rising, we then get what we consider our trade winds, which is now more of air moves back and forth along our surface. So instead of air just moving up and down and pulling it up and down, we can now have air that moves side to side. These angles, as we'll talk about in a moment, and the direction in which they're spinning deals a lot with the Coriolis effect, the fact that the Earth is rotating. Things in the northern hemisphere deflect to the right, and things in the southern hemisphere deflect to the left. So let's look at each set of these cells a little more closely. So here we have a diagram. So I'm trying to just I cropped it so you can only see then this section, so the northern Hadley cell and the southern Hadley cell. So because of strong solar heating, it leads to rising air, which diverges towards the poles, creating the intertropical convergence zone, which rides along on either side of the equator. So following the mouse on the screen, you can see that this hot air is being pulled along the surface. Once it gets to the equator, it rises up. As it rises up, it cools down, and then it actually, at this point, it converges here, then diverges away and creates a circular pattern. Now notice, in the northern hemisphere, it goes up from the equator, and then it heads towards the North Pole, sinks down. So it's kind of like a gear. Now, notice in the southern hemisphere that it does the same thing. It rises at the equator, but this time it's moving counterclockwise, moving down towards the South Pole. So these are always moving in that direction. You'll see that there's a pattern that's important to see and understand within this. So as the air moves towards the equator along the surface, it becomes weak. Due to the Coriolis effect, the northeast trade winds develop. So these are the northeast trade winds. What's interesting about the trade winds is that the name, the northeast trade winds, the cardinal direction, northeast, implies where the winds are coming from. So the winds are originating in the northeast and coming this way. So the southeast trade winds are coming out of the southeast and moving in that way. All right, the next one. So I kind of blurted out, but we're adding on to our globe. So now we can see the Ferrel cells. So the Ferrel cells are indirectly caused by the turning of the Hadley cells. So if you kind of, again, I kind of blurted a little bit, but there's your Hadley cell. But then notice that because it's coming down here, this is forcing it to move. So I think of it like gears and how they feed together, right? So this is moving in this direction and will always move in that direction. Now, because of that, because now you have a Ferrel cell and a Hadley cell, because they're mixing in the middle, that zone in which they meet is an area of high pressure, and it's known as the subtropical jet stream. So think about it, when air is being pushed down, you're applying additional pressure. Along the ITCZ, we can see it's an area of low pressure because air is lifting up. It's being forced upward. So we're creating this spinning cycle. So air flows north away from the subtropical high towards the subpolar lows and acquire a large westerly component, thus creating the westerlies, or the wind that comes from the west. So this is now your Hadley system from 0 to 30. Now we're looking at the Ferrel system from 30 to 60 degrees. So if you notice that we live here in Los Angeles, we deal predominantly with the Ferrel cell system. Moving forward, we can look at now the polar cells, which is from 60 to 90 degrees of latitude. So again, I've blurred out everything in between, but you can still see that part the whole. So that idea of the gears, of how they work together and mix. So same thing, the air sinks, very cold, dense air sinks at the North Pole. So that creates an area of high pressure. It drags along the bottom, gets forced up because of the Ferrel cell, and continues this mixing. So surface air moves from polar highs to subpolar lows. Subpolar lows are very warm, polar highs are cold. The Coriolis effect force directs the surface winds to the west, creating the polar easterlies. So we can see there's this pattern in which the air is moving. All right, so here we have our cells. Bump, bump, bump. Perfect. We can see areas of high and low pressure. We can see that we have a polar jet stream in here, subpolar jet stream. The ITCZ is along the equatorial zone. Perfect. So we may also see our trade winds here. So again, we know that things in the northern hemisphere deflect to the right. So that means they move clockwise, see? Things in the southern hemisphere turn counterclockwise. So the Coriolis effect, essentially, my whole life, I was told that the reason our toilets move to the right is because of this effect. But the reality is that's not true. It's because you need a larger surface area for that to be done. A toilet isn't enough to do that. So the toilets are designed to swish that way. There was a great video done by a bunch of guys. They took huge swimming pools, those big backyard up on above the ground swimming pools, put them on stilts, filled it with water and food coloring. Did one in the northern hemisphere, one in the southern hemisphere, pulled a plug out of the middle, and did not agitate or move any of the water. It wanted it to drain on its own. And they found because it had such a large surface area that you did actually see that motion in the northern hemisphere of it moving clockwise or to the right, and then counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. So you need a much larger surface. But think about this when going back into previous lectures when discussing extreme weather, looking at cyclones and anticyclones, looking at large weather systems. This has a big effect on the direction in which those systems rotate. So I have this image here to move forward. I found this great diagram, then I added these little guys to show you again. It's essentially the same thing we just looked at, but I liked it because it was a little simpler. So this would be a great way to draw it out for yourself to be able to see, okay, I get it. There's Hadley, Ferrel, and polar cells. Again, note the direction in which the cells are moving. This is rising off of the equator, sinking down here. It's rising here and sinking down here. When air pushes down together, it creates a zone of high pressure. When air is rising or lifting up, it creates an area of low pressure. So we can see we have these cells, again, they're tubes that wrap all the way around. So if that isn't quite the nail in the coffin to help you understand it, I found this. This is a little silly animation that kind of shows everything all together. So again, another way that we can see this, you can see the title on this is convection, which is the idea that hot air rises and mixes. So this is equilibrium at its best. You have warm, humid air, cold, dense air, and they mix. That is normal. If this system did not work, if we did not have a three-celled model, weather would be very, very different. Climate would be very, very different. Areas within the tropical zones would continue to become warmer. Areas in the colder regions would maintain their temperature and moisture patterns of cold and dry. So this really helps drive our weather system. This helps with the uneven heating of our Earth's surface. It helps with mixing the air parcels and also helps with moving moisture around our planet. All right, moving forward, we can look at some air masses. So what are air masses? Well, and within all of this, air masses are large bodies of air with a uniform temperature and humidity, which means it's, there are these like pockets of air. You can think of air masses as like pouring oil into like a bowl or a plate of water, and you can see that there's that, that bubble. There's a very defined boundary between the oil and the water, right? And so that is because they have densities that separate the two. Well, think about that for air masses, that we have these big blobs of air masses that can move. So like using this diagram here, if I hit play, you can see that this is an air mass that's moving. They're using colors to show it, but that's an Arctic blast that comes through. That's a large low pressure system that's pushing through, and it's bringing in colder temperatures, and in this case, is bringing in some moisture. So the origin of the mass provides some of the characteristics of what to expect, right? So when we talk about even hurricanes and larger weather systems, we want to know where it originated from and where it's traveling to, because that's going to give us a lot of information on the way that it's going to operate. So as we can see, continental air masses, or an air mass that develops on a continent, gets a lowercase c, which means it will be a drier air mass. Maritime air masses, which are air masses that develop over the ocean or large bodies of water, are given the lowercase letter of m, meaning that it will be moist air. So this really makes a difference between dry and moist air. So let's look at this slide here that kind of puts it together. So these are our 5 dominant air mass systems. This is where they originate from, but do they move all over the place? Yes, they do. That's why we get days that are sunny and some days that are rainy. That's why we experience pressure changes, moisture changes, humidity, because these air masses work. We talk about a large air mass coming in. Maybe one that you've heard of often during El Nino years would be like the Pineapple Express. That's a very particular type of air mass that's moving in. So the first one we have is the continental polar. So that means it's cold and dry, which means it's based off of a continent, but it's polar air. So it originates closer to the poles and over landlocked regions. Continental tropical is warm and dry. It originates closer to the tropics and over landlocked regions. So continental tropical. The maritime polar is cold and damp. It originates closer to the poles, but over water. Maritime tropical is warm and humid, originates closer to the tropics and over the water. And then lastly is the continental Arctic, which is very cold, originates in very cold landlocked areas. So when you start seeing these different letters that are, positioned here on this map of North America, can you figure out which air mass is which? So what would be the CT? What would be the MT? What would be an MP? Okay. So I'm not going to ask you to memorize how in the way that these operate, but I do ask you to be familiar with air masses and essentially what they mean. Okay, there is a difference between air masses that develop on land. There is a difference between air masses that develop on the water. And that should really help paint the picture, a better picture of on how our weather systems operate. So aside from air masses, we can also look at fronts. So fronts are really that zone between the two masses of air. So we can have cold fronts, warm fronts, stationary fronts, and occluded fronts. So a cold front is cold air advancing and displacing warmer air. This is the diagram on the map that we will use. So as an example, if I go back up here and I hit play again, this is a cold front moving in. You have colder air that is displacing the warmer air that was once down here. Okay. A warm front is when cold air is forced to retreat. So we use this diagram to show the direction in which it's going. You have a stationary front, which means that nothing really moves. They're meeting somewhere in the middle. So while differing air masses may exist along a boundary, very little movement is analyzed or observed. So they kind of just cram into one another and stay there. And one does not overcome the other. In a cold front, the cold front overcomes the warm, and in a warm front, it overcomes the cold. But stationary fronts are stuck. And then occluded fronts are very complicated because it's where the surface low becomes completely surrounded by cooler, colder air, and the occlusion process can be a cool type or cold type. So it gets a special purple color. So let me show you examples of all four of these to try to help. So here are our examples. So I have, which is which, right? So we have cold fronts, warm fronts, we have occluded fronts, and we have stationary fronts. So let's start with this top left one. Which one would this be? Well, we can see that this cold air is moving in and forcing the warm air up. So this must be a cold front. Correct. Moving down here, moving counterclockwise, here we have the direction of the front. It's moving this way. This warm air is overcoming the cold air. So what type of front would this be? A warm front. That's correct. Then moving here, we have cold air, warm air. Neither of them are going to be able to overcome one another, so they just literally just crash into one another. What would this be? A stationary front. That's correct. Now this one's a little bit more complicated. So here we have cold air moving down here, but we have cold air that's still moving. You see how this pocket of warm air has lifted up and how it's kind of overcoming a little bit there, but allowing the cold air to go underneath? What would that be? That's your occluded front. So you should be able to understand very simplistically the four types of fronts that we experience. You should be able to understand and explain the idea as to how, again, our air masses work and what they are. You should also be able to then understand and explain the three-celled model and to be able to identify each cell and the direction in which it moves in, and also to be able to then decipher, going back to this diagram, these different portions of our globe, subtropical highs, subpolar lows, the ITCZ, to be able to understand this model. So I'm going to leave you with this diagram. This is a really, really old diagram, but it's kind of fun because this is like the classic putting everything together. It's got everything on there. It's going to have all of your different trade winds. It's going to show essentially the cycle in which a lot of the air moves within our three-celled models. So it shows a little bit of everything on there. So it's a little complicated, I know. But I think that by the time you've worked through our entire presentation, you should be able to at least understand a little bit about this diagram, and you should be able to then answer some questions that have come up and go, well, wait a minute, what happens along the equator? What happens at 30 degrees north? What happens at 60 degrees south when dealing with looking at how air moves. Well, that being said, I appreciate your time. I hope this was helpful in trying to plug in those last little pieces to understand essentially the movement and motion of air that builds off of the previous presentation that I gave that discussed our atmosphere and looking at pressure. And that being said, thank you, and we'll talk soon.